Tony here from Panama, who left in 1968. It reminds me of when my company was growing very fast. Univision Television decided to do a spot called Orgullo Hispano. And I was playing on TV once when the former president of Panama saw it and said, you know, we got to give this young man the key to the city. Why don't you invite him to Panama? So I went to Panama. My dad had already passed away, but I went with my mom, with my wife and kids. And when we cleared security and we went into the presidential palace, there was 3 ladies of different ages outside of the president's office. She was on a very tight time schedule. And when they saw my mother, it was like a rock star had walked in, because my mother was a 7th grade science teacher, and by coincidence had these 3 ladies as students, and they hadn't put 2 and 2 together. So immediately we went into the president's office, and for the next 15 minutes they were telling the president how my mother literally changed her life. She was one of the best school teachers ever. So like clockwork, they knock on the door 20 minutes later, and it's the photographer. The president grabs the key to the city and says, okay, well, let's give the key to the city to the teacher. So, she had forgotten I was there. So the photographers came in, pictures, my mom's in the newspapers. So, I was talking to my mom after that. I was very proud of her, of course. And it was a time in my life where I had a lot of financial success for the first time, and it takes a mother to kind of poke a needle in one's ego and bring you back down to earth. And I said, my mom, what does this all mean? And in Spanish, my mom put her arm around me, and she said, hijo, esto es para que tú nunca te olvides que tu vida nunca se va a medir por todas las cosas materiales que acumulas. Tu vida siempre se va a medir por cuántos corazones tocas. And what that means is that this is so that you never forget that your life will never be measured by all the material things that you accumulate. Your life will always be measured by how many hearts you touch. And I was remembering that story. I was listening to my very long bio. And what I hope today is to share some words with you and touch your hearts today. I don't have a speech. I don't go around the country giving speeches. I just wrote down some notes. I want to tell you about why I wrote this book and tell you some of the leadership lessons that were ahas for me. There's 20 different leadership lessons in there, and they're all, it's not a leadership book that says, leaders do this or do that. It's real stories, and each lesson maybe has 10 different stories which you'll be able to relate to, and hopefully it'll inspire you to become a much better leader. The White House Fellowship Program was started by Lyndon Johnson in 1965. And Lyndon Johnson, when he left Texas, he worked for a young congressman, and his whole life was about mentors. He had incredible mentors, which allowed him to become the president of the U.S. Senate, and then finally become the president of the United States through a lot of different circumstances. And he was an incredible leader. And he felt that when this country was founding, you had the Jeffersons and the Washingtons and the Franklins and all these incredible men and women. Where are they in this country? How can we create a program to bring them to Washington? And one of the reasons that I wrote this book, and I'm speaking to you today, is I'm trying to get more Latinos and Latinas to apply for the program and go to Washington for this one-year program. The average age is between 30, 35. They're mid-year professionals at the height of whatever profession they're in. They're athletes, they're religious people, they're doctors, they're lawyers. So they come from a cross-section of professions and a cross-section of America. If you're not in that time window, there is no age limit, but that's typically where they're at. If you know friends or daughters or uncles or cousins that are in that, please bring the program up to them. If you get selected, you go to Washington for 1 year. You work for the president, you work for the vice president, or you work for a cabinet secretary directly for 1 whole year. And you get a lot of different assignments depending on where you work. You also have 75 to 80 lunches at the White House, 2 or 3 lunches a week, and you meet with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the President of the United States, the First Lady, senators, Fortune 500 CEOs, and they come for 2 hours, typically, completely off the record. You can ask them anything you want, and they share with you their leadership experiences. Then there's a travel component. The class, which is typically 11 to 14 fellows, pick anywhere they want to go in the world, and they typically go for 2 to 3 weeks. And they come back and they write a report to the president of what they learned. They also travel to some place in the country, and they try to learn about certain issues in that state or that region. And the last thing they do is they go on a military trip. So in my year, we wanted to spend the night on a submarine. Because, you know, how many people get a chance to do that? So that's what we did. Sometimes they go to an aircraft carrier. Sometimes they do things at military bases and try to get an appreciation of the military. So you do that for 1 year, and then you go back to wherever you came from. And White House fellows have run for president, they're cabinet secretaries. It really supercharges their career. One White House fellow that I had an interesting experience with was General Colin Powell. General Colin Powell was a fellow in 1973 when he was just a major in the Army. And of course I wanted to interview him. So when I wrote the book, because no one had ever written a book about the fellowship, I sent all the White House fellows a questionnaire with 8 questions. So I got an email back from Powell, and I said the first thing is, I had used the word secret in the title, Leadership Secrets of the White House Fellows, and I had also used the word elite in the subtitle, and he thought the word elite was pretentious, and secret, it almost sounded like we were giving away government secrets, so he wasn't going to participate unless I changed the title. So I worked with the publisher, I changed the title, he said he would participate. I then sent him the questions, and then he wrote back and said, Garcia, you need to do your homework. Those 8 questions, if you read my biography, which I assume you did if you were doing your homework, you would see were answered in there, so why don't you just go ahead and read my book? There's really no need for an interview. So I said, all right. So I had already read his book, but I went ahead and wrote 8 much tougher questions. So he emails me back, Garcia, I thought you were going to do your homework. If you had noticed, there are 2 books that have been written about me in the last year and a half. One of them just came out 2 months ago, and all the answers to those questions are in those 2 books. So at this point, my wife is like, Charlie, you're like a celebrity stalker. Just leave the guy alone. He doesn't want to talk to you. So what I did then is I interviewed, he had been head of the National Security Council, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Secretary of State. So he had White House fellows that worked for him because he was a cabinet secretary. So I interviewed all of them, and I said, if there was one question you could ask General Powell, that if you asked that question, he would get up and walk away from a televised interview, what would that question be? So I collected them all, and I sent it to him. So he emails me back, Garcia, I see you finally did your homework. When are you available? So I interviewed him for a couple hours. He was very gracious, and he contributed a lot to the project.